Hey everyone, how's it going? It's Blake here with ChessPathways.com, and in today's openings video, we're going to be discussing the Blackmar-Diemer Gambit. The Blackmar-Diemer Gambit can be reached by a couple different move orders. I'll show the most well-known one here to start with. White plays d4, black plays d5, we get a symmetrical queen's pawn opening, and now white plays this somewhat unusual move, knight to c3. It's not too often that you'll see white block in their c-pawn in a queen's pawn opening, because this pawn can easily come to c4, and help out in the fight for the center. But okay, knight c3, knight f6, and now the Blackmar-Diemer Gambit is this pawn sacrifice, pawn to e4. So white's going to lose a pawn here because black has two attackers here on this e4 pawn, and white only has one defender. But after d takes e4, white's idea is to play f3 and try to open some lines to accelerate their development. After e takes f3, white can actually recapture with the knight or with the queen. Let's take a look at knight takes f3 to start with. And in exchange for a pawn, white has a space advantage here, white has the lone pawn here in the center, and white also has a lead in development, and white's hoping to use some pressure on these E and F files to possibly generate an attack. So I pulled a sample line here to illustrate white's ideas. This came from a master level game from the 70s. Here black played bishop g4 to pin that knight, white continues with bishop c4 eyeing this f7 square. Black actually has to watch out, because if black does not address a threat that white has here, let's say black does nothing, white's threatening to play bishop takes f7, and after king takes f7, white's going to get their piece back with knight e5, forking the king and bishop, so black does not want to allow that. After bishop c4, black played e6, and now white gets castled, and we see that because the f-pawn's missing, this rook is already very active here on this f1 square. Black played c6, bishop g5, bishop e7, queen d2, knight b to d7, and rook a to e1. Both sides are really just finishing up their development, but here we see these rooks have finally arrived at their destination on the E and F files, exerting a lot of pressure on the black position. After knight b6, white wants to avoid exchanges, white played bishop b3. Black goes ahead and takes here on f3, but now white has the bishop pair. And now after knight b to d5, white went ahead and returned to the pair of bishops they took here on f6, with the idea to begin kingside operations after queen f4, and now this lifted rook swung over to the h-file, and white's trying to get an attack against this black king. Later in the game, white succeeded in tripling on the f-file after provoking some weaknesses here like h6, and eventually white crashed through and won the f-pawn and went on to win the game. Even g4, g5 could be an idea at some point, driving this knight away, although of course that's very double-edged, and it exposes the white king as well. So there's an example of knight takes f3, White can even take back with the queen here, though, and let black take a second pawn if black wants it. Of course, this undefends the d-pawn, so black can choose to take that pawn and play queen takes d4, but this exposes black's queen a bit here, and white's going to get even a bigger lead in development by attacking that queen. I pulled a game here that was played by David Goodall back in the 70s, where white won a nice little miniature here. Bishop e3, black played the main move queen g4, trying to exchange queens and consolidate their two extra pawns. Of course, white should definitely not exchange queens here. You don't want to go to an endgame 2 pawns down, that would end your chances of getting compensation for those pawns. So queen to f2, black grabs some space with e5, white plays bishop e2 to attack that queen, queen b4, and white goes ahead and castles, getting this rook active on this d-file. Bishop d6 was played, shutting down that d-file for now and developing a piece. And computers prefer the black position here. They say white has some compensation for the 2 pawns, but not enough. Obviously, 2 pawns is a lot to give up, and black can probably defend with best play, but we're going to see in the game how white got an advantage. White played knight b5, not only attacking the bishop here, but also the c7 pawn, in case that bishop moves away at some point. And now after a6 was played, white had the idea to deflect this queen away from the bishop, so that white can sacrifice the exchange on d6 and take back with the knight to give a check to this uncastled king. So a3, white's trying to harass that queen, and after queen a5, now b4, harassing that queen even more. Black probably could have considered here giving up the bishop for this pawn. After bishop takes b4, a takes b4, black would get to play queen a1 check, king d2, knight e4, and it looks like this might refute white's idea. Even though both queens are under attack, so it's not like black is just winning a queen here, even the exchange of queens would not be helpful for white if white's trying to get compensation for these pawns. Black would get to play queen a1 check, king d2, knight e4 check, king e1. I'm assuming the player with black saw this line, but just failed to assess this position properly. Currently, black's down a piece because they sacrificed a bishop here on b4, and if black takes the queen here, Now white will get to throw in knight c7 check before taking back the queen, and that line is good for white. Even though white's rook on h1 is falling, so is the rook here on a8. So black didn't want to go for that here after king to e1. If black tries to play a desperado here and get a rook for their queen before taking white's queen, this does turn out to work out for black. After bishop takes d1, knight takes queen, knight takes c7, now there's king d7. And after knight takes a8, knight takes h1, knight b6 check, saving that knight from the corner. Concretely, this works out to be good for black, although it's easy to see why black was scared to go for this. White is currently down the exchange, but this knight is trapped in the corner, and if they can win it back, then white will have 2 minor pieces for the rook. However, black remains up 2 pawns, and this position favors black. So going back to the game, it's easy to see how black misevaluated the position after this sacrifice, but they missed that white just has a very strong attack after white's allowed to implement their threat. Black instead played just queen to a4, and now white sacks the exchange here on d6. It's not too late for black to play a takes b5 here, and black probably stands pretty well there, although the position's pretty complicated. But after c takes d6, black accepts the exchange sacrifice, knight takes d6, king e7, bishop c5, queen f5 check, and the attack is quickly overwhelming to the black king. King c7, queen takes e5, and white is simply winning. I'll just show the finish here, knight c6, a nice little discovery here, knight b5 double check, king d8, queen c7 check, knight d6, and queen takes f7, checkmate. So there was a fun example of this queen takes f3 move, the double pawn sacrifice with queen takes d4, and despite the fact that the computer doesn't really like white's position in these lines, it says that 2 pawns is simply too much to give up for the compensation that white gets, in practice, white has actually scored pretty well in this line, which shows that it can be difficult to defend with black. Okay, so we've looked at a lot of the main lines here. Now let's talk about some alternatives that both players have early on. So after f3, we looked at e takes f3 accepting the gambit. Black can also defend this pawn with the bishop, and black is still up a pawn for now. I think the main reason this line isn't too popular for black is that white can play g4 here. And after bishop g6, now g5, driving this knight away, and then white's going to win their pawn back here on e4. The main line here continues knight d5, and now white can't really take back with the f pawn and get this full center, because black can remove the defender here of this e4 pawn, and after b takes c3, bishop takes e4, black is clearly better. Black's just up a clean pawn. So going back here after knight d5, white has to take with the knight here on e4 to get their pawn back, but this is certainly not a line that black needs to fear. Black can just play e6 here and open a path for this bishop. Black could even try something like f5 here, trying to drive this knight away, and if white takes en passant, then black could take with the e-pawn here and try to open this e-file to the white king. White's king side is pretty exposed too in this position. So that's one alternative move here, play bishop f5 to try to defend this pawn. Going back a couple moves here after e4, if black doesn't want to accept this gambit, black can also play e6 here. And now we are actually in the main line of the French defense, which would be after e4, e6, d4, d5, knight c3, knight f6. So that's good to know. If you're playing the Blackmar-Diemer as white, you have to be ready to play against the French defense if that's what black wants to do. Another alternative can be found here on move 3. We've looked at taking with the pawn, and we've looked at switching to the French defense with e6. Taking with the knight is also a very serious move. And now the game is going to go a little differently than a mainline Blackmar-Diemer Gambit. If white doesn't take this knight, then white really has no compensation for a pawn. So after knight takes e4, f takes e4. Now black's up a pawn, but this pawn here on e4 could potentially be weak. White could still try f3, and then we would end up in a position that looks like it's from the mainline Blackmar-Diemer, except the 2 knights are missing here, which I always felt favored black. Usually exchanging pieces helps the player with a space disadvantage, and also trading pieces helps the player who is going to come under attack. So those are 2 good reasons why this should favor black. This knight could quickly come to f6 and take that knight's place in some lines as well. Although I guess from white's perspective, you could argue that this knight on f6 was a great defender of black's kingside, and this replacement is going to take some time to show up there, so maybe white could exploit it in the meantime. But a lot of times in this line, white will not play f3, white can just play bishop c4 and leave this doubled pawn on the board. And I'll just show one sample line here. Black could play bishop f5 and add some defense to this pawn. And now after c3, e6, white could play g4 and try to harass this bishop. Bishop g6, h4, threatening to trap it with h5, so black plays h5 himself. And if white plays g5 here, black can simply play c6, get some more control here of the d5 square, getting ready to play knight d7 and knight b6. And objectively, white probably doesn't have enough compensation for the pawn, although again, in a practical game, it can be a different story. Finally, I mentioned we could reach the Blackmar-Diemer Gambit from a couple different move orders. So far we've been looking at knight c3, knight f6, and then e4. White could also play e4 right here on move 2. And this has some pluses and minuses. One advantage for white is you avoid the knight takes e4 line that we just looked at. If black wants to accept this gambit, they're going to have to take with this pawn, they're not going to get to exchange knights. You also avoid some other weird sidelines that black could switch to after knight c3. For example, after knight c3, some players with black here will switch to a Dutch defense and play f5, really clamping down on the e4 square. And from black's perspective, black could argue that this knight on c3 really doesn't make much sense in a Dutch defense, especially a stonewall Dutch defense, which is what we're going to get after e6 and c6. This knight's just extremely restricted. It has really no squares to go to or even influence here. So some players might want to avoid this and play this move order with e4 on move 2 when they're trying to play the Blackmar-Diemer Gambit. Some downsides, this gives black some extra possibilities here. Black could go back to the French defense, but white's going to have to know a little bit more about the French defense if they want to play this move order instead of the one we looked at, because if white plays knight c3, black doesn't have to play knight f6 and go to a classical French. Black could also play the winnower variation with bishop b4, and I would assume most players who play the Blackmar-Diemer Gambit don't know much about playing the white side of the French defense, because they're playing 1d4 here, and the French defense is a king's pawn opening, so they probably haven't studied that much. So that's one thing to be aware of. Also, after d5, e4, black could also play a Caro-Kann defense with c6. So again, the lesson is if you want to play this move order with e4 on move 2, you might want to brush up on your king-pawn openings as well. Also, it gives black some extra possibilities after they accept the gambit. For example, after d takes e4, knight c3, black could transpose to the line we just looked at with knight f6, but black could also play a move like f5. White's actually considered to get better compensation here than they usually get in the Blackmar-Diemer, just because this exposes black's king a bit, and it's not really a developing move, but it's just good to be aware that this extra option exists. Thank you very much for watching, and please make sure you visit chesspathways.com and get signed up. I'll put a link down in the description. Please click it and sign up right now. It's totally free, only takes a couple seconds, and I will send you a free move-by-move guide to chess thinking along with lots of other free content when you do. I'm trying to help more chess players become masters, hopefully in a fraction of the time that it took me. Thanks, and I'll see you there.